You're listening to the Weekly Geekly, Omaha's counterculture podcast.
You're listening to the Weekly Geekly, the only podcast that has the stomach to challenge the Grendel Kahn himself. I'm Mikey Colsheen. Sitting with me is a couple worthy nerds, worthy enough to talk to the Kahn. Guys, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
May Miller here. That's all the introduction I want to allow.
Just May.
Just May.
Just May. That's all you get. And, of course, the guy who got me into Matt Wagner's work himself.
I am Jake Barnett, and just hanging out one episode, I guess.
Hell yeah. Well, we've been trying to do an episode to revolve around Grendel. And, you know, who better to talk to about it than the man himself, Mr. Matt Wagner. We got lucky enough to kind of rub shoulders on social media and said, hey, why don't we sit down and talk to him and see what he was thinking when he made this crazy journey that is Grendel. So, Matt, thank you so much. We really appreciate you for taking the time, man.
My pleasure to be here. How you guys? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, man.
As well.
Yeah.
You have left quite the impression on me and Jake with Grendel. I'm not going to lie. We definitely hopped on the Grendel train later than most. I'll say that.
Oh.
We started reading it, 2-3 years ago, at least?
Yeah.
Maybe 5.
Somewhere about.
Yeah.
Did you guys jump on with the omnibus editions? Because that was a pretty good jumping on spot.
That's actually a funny question, because when I found out about Grendel, Jake was just collecting the single issues, collectors wise. And I went out immediately after reading 2 issues.
Yeah.
And I think I literally bought all 4 omnibuses at our local comic book store.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he was all like, damn it, dude, you're spoiling it for me, because part of the adventure was going out and finding these books and being like, I'm never going to know what happens till I find it. It's the hunt. And I'm like, no, let me ruin that for you. Just read all of them right now. But yeah,
it's funny. My, my son who I work with, he's my colorist. He's a big comics fan, and I'm constantly having to describe to him how back in my day, being a comics fan was being a treasure hunter. You really, really had to dig. And there was no databases. There was you just kind of had to hear about shit, and you'd look stuff up in the comic price guide, and be like, ooh, what's that? And go looking for that one,
And we don't really have that anymore,
now it's just touch a button and there it is.
I can go on Diamond or somewhere else and just boom, there I am,
Mm-hmm.
But this totally brought me back to that beginning age of comics for me. Being like 4 or 5 years old, going with my grandma or my grandpa and like finding out about stuff at the store.
Yep.
So it totally was a reminiscent time for me of that 90s era.
Absolutely. And I
actually,
when I stumbled upon the first series of yours that I was actually introduced to was War Child, and I had been out of comics for quite a while, but that's actually what brought me back in. I was living in Arizona in a random Goodwill and found the whole series on one of the shelves, and I was just started thumbing through it. I was like, I gotta have this, man. This is
big score there. That's great.
Yeah, I was.
It's rare that you get like an entire run, especially something that's older. You're like, damn, I'm only getting like everything but the 3rd and 5th, and then you never quite know what happens.
Well, and now like looking back, I realize how lucky I was, because now I'm still hunting out old issues, and like I'm running into that problem still. I'm missing 3 and 5
We know there's a new one coming, correct? Or no?
Yes,
I had heard. We were
Odyssey,
just talking
correct?
about that.
Working on it right now, as a matter of fact. And
wow.
Very nice.
If you like War Child, it's Grendel Prime. So.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So Grendel Prime is obviously going to space.
Yep, it's Grendel Prime in outer space. Yep.
That's going to be
And I'm
crazy.
going for a total like 70s heavy metal magazine kind of vibe. I'm
That's
I'm
awesome.
trying to do something where the style of science fiction is just a tiny bit mystical. It's more like a lone wanderer exploring the cosmos. For Grendel reasons, but rather than a more organized space exploration sort of scenario.
That's going to be fun.
Nice.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
Are there vampires?
We'll find out if there's vampires.
All right.
Playing it close to the chest. I like it.
That's something I really enjoyed. Once even in the Hunter Rose Origins, there was Argent. He was the only real kind of mythical thing we could get our hands on until post Spar. When you brought it into the Orion and even with the Church, then we kind of got the introduction of vampires. There's more than just them out there. And I like that whole tie-in with the Church. I think that was something that even aesthetically kind of grabbed me. When you showed me that run, I was just like, oh, yeah. That giant twist at the end with the Pope and how everything was just kind of sadistic and dark. And I think one of the things that drew me to Grendel was I felt like it took big swings. We were just discussing this outside, actually. We were just nerding out like we do. And Jake was like, I really, really want to discuss Devil's Child because it was one of the darkest parts of the story. Like, what was the deciding factor for you to make that so dark?
You mean Devil Child?
Yeah.
Or just Grendel in general? Well, I didn't write Devil Child. That was actually written by my sister-in-law.
Really?
Yeah, longtime editor Diana Schutz. And of course, it's a very female-specific viewpoint. So it made sense that she should write it. She's not. Diana plies her trade in editing and doesn't really feels like she needs to write a whole lot, but she felt compelled to write that one, so that was great. But you were talking there about the supernatural aspects of it. Part of what spawned that at the very beginning was I was trying to, when I first created Grendel way back in 1981, I think. There weren't a lot of anti-heroes in comics at that point. Certainly not with their own titles.
Right.
Marvel had attempted to do a few, supervillain team-up specials,
Yeah.
Those books never really sold that well because those characters weren't really the main character. They were the villain from some other book,
Yeah.
So I was inspired by a variety of factors to try and do this kind of anti-hero thing. And, my twist was to make the bad guy be the handsome, beautiful, debonair person and have the good guy be this brutal, savage beast.
Right.
And so I wasn't really – it's funny because if you look at my stuff, I'm kind of what they call a genre masher, and the funny thing is I don't even really think about it very much. I just, if it feels right to throw something in there, I do it. So since I ended up having this werewolfish character in the first storyline, that led me into vampires. And then, of course, kind of a worldwide plague of vampires for a while there.
That was
natural progression.
Yeah, right. Of course. What else is going to happen?
Well, it's funny you should say natural progression because, of course, when Grendel first appeared, it was a black and white, a part of the black and white thing of the 80s, and then I got the opportunity to develop Mage, my other book, in color. And after a while, I started getting responses from people, "Hey, you never finished the Grendel story. What happened there?" So that's when I kind of rewove it into what became Devil by the Deed, which originally appeared as 4-page backup stories in each issue of Mage.
Mm-hmm.
I forget where I was leading with it. Well, yeah, I totally lost my place there. Here's the point. So then at the end of Devil by the Deed, I had killed Hunter Rose, and that's when the original publisher approached me and said, "We want to make this a monthly comic." And I said, "Well, I just killed the main character.
Yeah.
How's that going to work?" So that's when I came up with the idea of the character being a generational character, kind of like the Phantom, the Phantom in the old comic strips. It was a character that many people wore the mask.
I was really curious behind that, because it felt like when you read the entire series, 1 to 4, all the omnibuses, it doesn't feel like you didn't have the intention.
Oh, I had no fucking idea. I was making up.
But from
you played it off well.
Right, you did a really good job of transitioning between Hunter Rose and then Christine Spar. I'll even say into the boyfriend at the end of Spar's.
Yeah. Well, again, part of that was I was a very young artist and I was very full of I was very full of ideas. I was very full of energy, and I figured the only way to do a continuing series that would be interesting to me, and it, my contention has always been, if I'm going to do something, it's got to be interesting to me, or it's not going to be interesting to my readers. Was to just continually reinvent it all the time. So have the persona move from character to character to character. So then, we had Hunter Rose, then we had Christine Spar, then we had Brian Lee Sung, and I recognized at that time, I was like, oh, I can't just keep handing this off to the next person. That's going to get boring and repetitive.
Yeah. I feel like
that time, Bernie Moreau, the guy that drew the third storyline, The Devil Inside, said to me, because, we were kind of speaking as Grendel as some sort of demonic force, even though it's never explicitly described that way in the book. But he said, could Grendel ever inhabit a whole crowd? And I thought, let's just have him take over the whole world.
Speaking of
laying the foundations for what eventually led to War Child, because, of course, we had to get there little by little by little,
Right.
That
was just a fun way to do it, though. Like, I love the rise and fall of You Now and all these little side stories you peppered into there. I went out and picked up the 1 and 2 that you did of the side stories, and I mean, we had read those, the Devil Tales, all those little side ones forever, and there was like 2 or 3 that I never even caught that were put in the omnibus, and I was like, I'm barely ever going to get this feeling again, I mean, until
we tried to make it as complete as we could, and we, a lot of, especially the Hunter Rose volume, it's made up of so many different short stories and such.
Right.
We tried to put those in chronological order so that you read it, as his life kind of unfolded. But you mentioned the 4 omnibuses. I will point out a little bit of self-promotion here. There are 2 Grendel Tales omnibuses as well that collect the various Grendel Tales series. So,
and those came out recently. I remember picking those up. Like I was saying, I read those, and then there were some stories we didn't even know existed. So I was like, oh, it's like Christmas again. Some of the side stories involving vampires, and there was another one I liked, but I had always really been driven to like the motorcycle gang one.
Yeah, that was a great one. Boy, that had a dark ending.
You talk about dark endings. Like, that was like poetic, And then the one that was, I'll always forget the name. I think it's the 4 Devils, but it's kind of more Baton Rouge oriented.
Yeah, 4 Devils, 1 Hell.
Yeah.
That was fun.
That's actually one of the ones I was talking about earlier that I'm missing, like 3 and 5.
Yeah. I think after the episode we should probably exchange, because I might have some extras. So let's look. Yeah. This is really exciting for me, because I think the one thing that hooked me after reading 1, 2, into 3 and all this stuff was 4, when you did the comeback novelization with Grendel Prime, being discovered by that young Grendel. I'll always forget her name, though.
Susan Verhagen.
Remember, she's kind of questioning her status as a Grendel, and she finds him in this old, like, frozen over tomb in the mountain, and it reawakens him, and then kind of has this internal struggle with, am I really following the right crowd? Is Grendel who I should define myself as, or should I define myself based on my own measure? And it was a cool little thing, because it went from, 3.5 books of comic to 50, 60 pages of a novel with just a couple pictures to kind of give you a visual step. But that was kind of one of the stories for me that hit home, because Grendel Prime had always been so mysterious through War Child. You never knew much about him. Then you got to see who he was a little bit. But this kind of encapsulated the idea that he's eternal, Yeah,
that one's written by Greg Rucka of Lazarus fame.
Awesome.
And the illustrations are by me. That's a terrific. And we originally intended to do that as 3 novels, and then you get pulled in different directions. We just never ended up doing it finally. But
Nope.
Yeah.
Kind of how everything goes.
So, I mean, touching on the subject of Grendel Prime being kind of this eternal figure, have you had any thoughts as to a Grendel after Prime? Or just one carrying the mantle?
It's a hard question.
Yeah, no, not really. And that's why somebody said to me, you should do another Batman Grendel crossover. And I said, no, I've done them. I've done the Alpha and the Omega. I did the tail ends of the, Batman meets the tail ends of the Grendel saga from beginning to end. So it would seem kind of repetitive to do it again,
Fair enough. I guess you did touch on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, we. I don't know if you guys saw the Grendel versus the Shadow crossover I did.
Yes, that was great.
I snatched that up as they came out. It was awesome.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun on that one. I'm a big Shadow fan from way back when. So.
I really enjoyed the death of Margot. That was great.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I enjoyed that too. Yeah, that was
a fun read.
The other day, when I was about 13, and I was just looking for something different in comics. So there were a few things that were around, but all of a sudden I got exposed to the Shadow. DC announced they were going to do the original Denny O'Neil, Mike Kaluta series. And so there were these ads that ran in all the DC books. And here was this guy pointing guns at you. And superheroes didn't use guns in those days. That was like, what? Who's this guy?
This is a little grittier than we're used to.
Yeah. And so then those came out, and I loved that. But then my parents were from World War II generation. And so they, actively listening to the Shadow radio show all the time and would tell me about that. So then around the same time, all of a sudden you could get a bunch of those radio episodes on LP discs. So I was picking up those. And then just around the same time, Pyramid Books started releasing the Shadow pulp novels with brand new covers by Jim Steranko. So all in the space of about 2 years, I got just like a giant triple dose of the Shadow that just sank into me hard and never let go.
Awesome. You can definitely see it in your work. As an artist, I feel like you've always kind of clung to what me and Jake love in comics, which is the darker side. It's not all Captain America and Superman, and there are real life consequences, and there's blood and gore and some self-loathing involved. I
love Captain America and Superman.
But I mean, I feel like that to me.
I always tell people I'm a Libra, so I like the good guy stories and I like the bad guy stories too.
Okay, well, fair enough. That's my position on my view on most of your work is that it tends to stick to that darker, grittier side.
I wouldn't call Mage that particularly. Mage.
No. I think that's your Libra balance, though. That's the light side, right?
Yeah. Yep.
I remember jumping in on that one. I think Hero Discovered, then Defined was where I left off. Mm-hmm. And then you came out with that new run of it, and I've been so far behind. I'm waiting for the volumes. So.
No, well, they're out.
They are? Okay, well, I'm gonna get on my local shop to buy those.
Yeah, we put it's a 6-volume collection, so each book of the trilogy is 2 volumes. So the Hero Discovered is volumes 1 and 2. The Hero Defined is 3 and 4, and then the new series, The Hero Denied, is volumes 5 and 6, and they are all available at your local comic book store.
Heck yeah! And when you're stopping by, go to our local sponsor, Krypton Comics in Omaha, Nebraska. Pretty much got the biggest selection in the Omaha area. Nicest guys in town, and they're always willing to special order. So check them out.
Cool ass name too.
Yeah, Krypton. Just don't bring the rocks.
I have a few questions for you, Matt.
Sure.
From the inception of your initial idea, what is your writing process from the idea to fruition?
Well, it's funny. It's changed over the years, and it changes by project. For instance, with Mage, since everybody knows that's kind of an allegory of my own life. With that one, I distinctly try to not do any prep work. I don't take any notes. I don't really do much in the way of layouts. I often don't even design characters. I just draw them right on the page. So I really treat it kind of like a Zen journey, I just sit down and and that's not to say that I don't have some ideas about where I want to go. Of course I do.
Right.
But I don't try to overthink it. And in fact, in those long years between the various volumes of Mage, I would actively try to not think about it in between hand and, just let it get to the point where all of a sudden all I could think of was Mage. And that meant I had to do Mage, Otherwise, because I am a writer artist and work almost exclusively that way, except when I'm writing for other people, it's very organic. So for instance, I don't write out a script beforehand. I sit down with the pages and, on a Grendel series, let's say, I do layouts, but then I sit down and I draw it first before I write the script. But as I'm drawing it in my head,
are you illustrating or doodles?
I'm sorry, I missed what you said there. Say it again.
Are you illustrating or are you doing thumbnails?
Yeah. They're very brief, believe me.
Okay.
But as I'm drawing, I'm working out the script in my head as I'm drawing, okay, this guy's saying this here, or okay, this bit of captioning would make this transition flow nicely from here to here.
Right.
And again, he's done it so damn long at this point. It's kind of instinctual,
Yeah, the second picture by now.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that kind of how you did the Hunter Rose series?
No, that was much
Did you
more.
just kind of draw it out, or did you have a roadmap before you drew, I guess?
You mean the very original one?
Yeah.
Devil by the Deed?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to beg out of that one just for sheer years between then and now. I don't really remember.
I've always been curious,
Makes
though,
sense.
just because that was one of the books to me that kind of redefined panel work.
Mm-hmm.
You did a lot of different pages. You turn into another story in that omnibus, and it'd be like a whole nother style. And then you had that really cool 2-page spread where him and Argent were going at each other.
Well,
and
the key there was, since I was revamping that entire storyline to be a backup story, I only had 4 pages every issue to get across a chunk of story. And that's not much.
Yeah.
So rather than, if I was just doing sheer panel-to-panel continuity, boom, you get a scene and a half maybe in 4 pages.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas by doing that, those complicated layouts and making it more of an illustrated story, I was able to cram in a whole lot more per page. And by presenting it as, the narrative structure is that this is a book that Christine has written about Hunter Rose. So I'm able to, refer to events that, we're not actually seeing depicted, but make the narrative seem larger and grander than it is, or than is being immediately depicted, So that was a big factor in why I chose to do it in that style.
Jumping off that past question, how do you stay inspired or creative?
Well, first time I ever met my father-in-law, my future father-in-law, I had hair halfway down my back, and he looked at this scruffy dude and he said, "Artist, huh? Aren't you looking for ideas?" And I very blithely said, "No, never." And truthfully, no, never. It's just at this point I'm like a shark. I got to keep swimming. That's just I don't know how to do anything else. If I slowed down too much, I don't know what I would do with myself. This is what I do. I tell stories. I tell stories constantly.
Ever felt burnout?
Yeah, sure. Specifically, I will say immediately here after finishing Mage, because of course, that was the culmination of a 35-year journey.
Right.
Yeah.
There again, I was jumping right over to Grendel, and of course, I'm really familiar with Grendel too. But I got to say, I was a little cavalier about, oh sure, I'll just jump right over into Grendel. But it's Grendel in outer space. It's completely and utterly different than the setting in Mage. So I kind of realized, wow, I am kind of burned out right now. I need to rejuice here a little bit. But I've always been pretty good at knowing how to jumpstart my muse. Part of that is, getting out. Don't stay where you're at and just look at the blank page or the blank drawing table.
Yeah.
Taunt you.
Get out, run some errands. I swim for exercise, so I'll go for a swim. Boy, that really clears your head.
Yeah.
And I don't know. At this point, I feel like I know how to summon my muse when she goes slipping away.
That's good.
That skill.
Yeah, we all need to acquire that skill, so that's good.
I will say it only takes 35 years.
Yeah, right. We're right on schedule, guys. We're gonna make it. There you go. Grendel Kahn told us himself.
And I just have one last question. What was the best piece of industry or business advice you've received from another artist or writer or anyone in the biz?
Advice. Let me think.
Or critique, whatever.
Not specific advice, but I used to be friends with Doug Wildey, who is a famous animator and creator of Johnny Quest.
Nice.
Oh, nice.
He was quite a bit older than me, had a very grandfatherly sort of aspect to him, but he was a guy that had been around the biz. He'd been in comics, he had been in animation, and he had a good business head on him. So I can't recall any specific advice he gave me, but just listening to him talk and listening to the way he approached his art as part of his business really struck me. But I can tell you a very heartwarming thing that somebody told me one time. So I was lucky enough to be a presenter at the very first Eisner Awards. And, this is a much smaller event back in those days.
Right. Yeah. Back in the OG days.
Yeah. So Will Eisner gave the keynote speech. And, he gave this just incredibly moving, rousing speech about his love for this medium and how he sees so much potential in it, and it hasn't even begun to tap its potential, and the great things he hoped for from young creators in the future, and if by lending his name to this award he helped further that ideal, he was just honored to do it. I'm telling you, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Everybody was just like, "Oh God, I want to go home and draw comics." Right? And so, okay, we get to the end of the whole ceremony, which again didn't last very long.
Yeah.
But in addition to being a presenter, I was up for a couple awards and I didn't win. But we sorry, I had to close the door there. So afterwards, we posed for some photos, and such. And then my wife and I go back to our hotel, and it just so happens to be the same hotel where Will's staying. And he and his wife, Anne, happen to get on the elevator at the same time as us. And he recognizes me from being on stage, but he doesn't really know me. And he's thrilled and happy and elated. And he says, "Oh, congratulations." And I had to go, "I didn't win anything, Will."
Well, congratulations on being a part of this.
Yeah. And he leaned over and he gave my shoulder a squeeze and he said, "Yes, you did."
Aw.
All right.
I about broke into tears, I'm telling you.
That's really nice.
All right, Eisner.
Yeah, very sweet, man.
Wow.
What advice would you give to young creators?
Young creators, I would kind of beg out because on one level, because the business has changed so much to where I'm not sure I understand aspects of it nowadays. It's changed so much with digitization and distribution and social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I could give a lot of advice to a creator artistically. And I do look at a lot of portfolios at cons. And I will say I think I'm pretty good at it, giving good advice.
You see my portfolio then. I have a few awards and for my portfolio.
I'm in Nebraska. I will. Okay.
Oh, I love critique, so I would enjoy that very much.
The one thing I tell people is, make sure you're not just drawing the stuff you like. You got to draw everything. You got to draw telephones and fire hydrants and fire escapes and everything that makes up the world your characters are going to inhabit, Well,
that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier about how you need to be mindful of your art as your business, because we're all doing this because we're fans,
Mm-hmm.
The only reason I have this show is because I'm a fan of people's work, so I feel this need to nerd out and share it with the world. The only reason you guys are writing it is because you have a passion for it, but you still have to balance in your Libra way that the aspect of actually making a career and being an artist, because artists in their nature, at least I don't know about you, but podcasting is starving. You know what I mean? Yeah. You're not always, and if you're doing it for the money, I feel like you just shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah,
but there is a certain thing to be said about putting in as much time as you do and as much dedication. You should be, compensated for that vision. But
sure. I would advise that everybody, if you have something that you're passionate about and you can figure out a way to make money at it, great, do it.
Why not? Yeah.
I was lucky enough to get in the business at a different stage than now. And so there again, I don't know what advice I could offer to young creators because I'm old and spoiled at this point,
Hey, you've been around, man.
Yeah, but I mean, I can hear what May's wanting some advice there on how to keep those fires burning,
Absolutely.
And a big part of it, I think, is just feeling like you have something to say, and if you ever took up a pencil, and if you ever tried to express yourself via either words or pictures, then you do feel that, and you need to figure out a way to communicate that to others. And there's just no denying some people are better at it than others. It's it's the same with every art. Some people play guitar better than others. Some athletes are better than others, etc.
Always be someone better than
you. But you can still utilize your talents.
Yeah. That's great advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Search for your message and don't be afraid to say it. Yeah. So what is if you could guess, what is Grendel Prime's message? what is he trying to convey to the world?
Well, Grendel Prime's a walking dichotomy, all of that world in Grendel, because it's so based around ideals of strength and honor and such like that, and yet at the same time, they're murdering bastards most of the time. I was just, does everybody watch Game of Thrones? Are you a big Game of Thrones fan?
Yeah.
So I just posted a thing on Facebook about how I just couldn't understand people getting so upset about the recent episode where Arya has sex. And everybody, there was so much recoiling from that and hand wringing and ooh, and that sort of stuff. And I said, I don't remember anybody complaining when all the underage murders she's committed on the show.
Yeah,
right. Disemboweling. She butchered a couple guys and baked them into a pie, and nobody said about it.
I feel like a lot of it is because when she was first on the show, she was 12 years old. So I feel like a lot of people still have that
they
image.
Still see her,
they still see her as.
Okay, you're missing my point. You're missing my point. If she was 12 years old, why didn't you get upset when she gouged a guy's eyes out with a knife?
Because society is blind.
We'd rather look at violence than sex.
I know the answer already. I just haven't.
Because our society lets our kids see, horrible decapitations, but then when there's a sex scene, they cover their eyes.
I told you I was doing that when the scene starts to unfold. I was like, oh, thank God.
Your head was in the right place.
She's more than a butcher.
Murdering the king. She still has some grasp on her humanity,
Yeah.
Yeah, not like a psychopath.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's funny.
Like you don't even know.
I've never. Okay, they make fun of me. I've never seen one episode of Game of Thrones.
No, it's quite good.
Yeah, oh, I know. I've been yelled at many times before. We're actually going to do an episode where it's like the trial of Mikey, but it's pretty much just an hour-long roast of 12 people yelling at me for never giving it a chance.
Yeah, I got a funny tale about how I discovered Game of Thrones.
How's that?
Pretty much like everybody else, by having breakfast with George R.R. Martin.
No shit.
No.
No big deal.
No,
we were both at this event in Spain. It was it's a little too weird to describe. It's comic festival, but it wasn't a convention.
Okay.
So he was a guest and I was a guest. I knew some of his earlier work. He knew Grendel. We both spoke English. It was like, hey, let's have breakfast. So we're having breakfast, and one of the guys, Darko Mason, one of the guys that wrote the Grendel Tales books, Devils and Deaths, he found out I was going to have breakfast with George. He got all excited. And he's like, oh, can I come? And I was like, yeah, sure. Come on. So we're eating breakfast, and he's all over George about these books. And I hadn't heard of Game of Thrones or A Song of Fire and Ice, which is what it's called in its novel form. Huh. And so George told me a bit about it. And, he only had 2 volumes out at that point. I picked them up as soon as I got home and loved them. So that's how I discovered Game of Thrones.
Yeah, that's how I got into it. So,
doesn't everybody have breakfast with George Martin? Come on.
Is Martin a coffee guy or a tea guy?
Oh, he's a coffee guy.
He's a coffee guy? Well, you write novels that thick, you're probably going to have to be. Right? Those things are... Yeah. Buy an extra copy to hold up the window. Those things are like monstrous, man. We just started selling the graphic novel version of those at the store I work at. And even those are big, and I'm just like, jeez. Like, if I ever need a weapon, it's that or the Walking Dead omnibuses, because those things are huge too.
Yeah.
Hey, May, I will follow up with a little bit of practical advice that I also got from Will Eisner. Because, everybody compares comics and film quite often, and they're not the same beast.
Oh, they're
And
different.
one of the big differences Eisner pointed out was that when you're watching a film, I mean, of course you can stop it whenever you want with a remote control, but basically you're sitting there and, in an ideal viewing situation in a theater, you don't have that control. You're viewing it as the director intended you to view it. But with a comic, there's always one point where the reader's in control, and that's in the turning of the page. And Eisner pointed out it behooves you to make the bottom right-hand section of the right-hand page as intriguing as you possibly can so that the reader will turn the page without even thinking about it.
That makes sense. Consumer behavior is nice.
Yeah.
And then save your tells, save your big reveals for page left,
Because, how many comics have you read where you turn the page and it's just a shocking double, page?
Mm-hmm.
That's a powerful message that comics have always used. But
Yep.
I love that. Man, I cannot wait for Odyssey. When can you tell us when it's dropping, or is that even
October? It'll premiere at the New York City Comic Con.
Dude, that's literally my birthday.
Oh, right.
I'm so excited.
Birthday.
Don't be surprised if somehow I figure out where you live and send you a copy and be like, hey, Matt, you want to sign this for me for my birthday?
What you got to do is we're going to continue running the letters column, the Grendel's Lair. So there will be information about where, we're going to set it up online, but there will be information about where to write in. So share your thoughts and all that shit. That'd be great.
Yes.
Hell yeah.
We're totally going to do that.
Yep.
All right, everybody working in the Weekly Geekly crew, if you're listening right
I
now,
need a hobo Grendel.
everyone's going to start writing in. Yeah, she jokes about a hobo Grendel. So we talked with Phil Hester over at a local con here, and he did the hobo version of Green Arrow. And you were actually doing cover art for that.
Yeah,
right?
I did the covers on that run. Yeah, yep.
Well, I was hanging out with him and Andy, and when we interviewed Phil, we talked about Hobo Green Arrow because he was making a commission where he drew Hobo Flash versus Hobo Green Arrow. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need pictures of this. And when we were talking, I was like, how great would it be if you just started making a Hobo DC universe? Just every hero fell on hard times. And he was like, he goes, I think the hardest one would be Batman. And I was like, oh yeah, he's rich by superpower. And so when we saw him at PlanetCon in Kansas City, I just kind of cornered him and Andy and went, all right, you're going to do this. So now we've got it hanging in our studio, and every time we'll bring up ideas to creators, May just goes, do a hobo version, do a hobo Hellboy, do a hobo this. I'm just like, oh, God.
Well, I'd say we already did it in Grendel with Epi Thatcher, who of course is street level, drug addicted.
He's more of a meth head.
I was gonna bring that one up.
That was such a cool tie-in. Like when he was kind of having those trips, he would do the drug and then he would trip out and kind of have these spirit quests where it was all kind of leveled out and he saw things.
Spirit quests.
Yeah. Those couple scenes where it was like George Washington as the head with Jesus on the cross and like all these different visualizations. I was literally freaking out.
Yeah, we're real subtle.
Oh, not at all. And just as much as when Hunter sees the imp. Remember, he traps the imp in the circle there, and then the imp starts spewing out all the knowledge of the rest of the story of Grendel. Like you see Spar and the vampire and all this different stuff, and I kind of loved Hunter's reaction. He was like, I want to be the only Grendel, god damn it. Like, I am Hunter Rose. No one can be Grendel. It's me. And then, kind of don't have a choice.
Let me tell you about how that came about. That series, Behold the Devil. So I did that for the 25th anniversary of Grendel. And so I was talking to Diana Schutz, who wrote Devil Child, as I said, but was the longtime editor on Grendel. Yeah. And she said, okay, if we're going to do this, you got to do a Hunter Rose story. And I was like, I've told pretty much all of Hunter's stories at this point. And I said, all right, well, I'll come up with something. She said, all right, and if you do, it's got to be important. It can't be just like a caper.
Right.
And I said, I already told all this important shit. And so then I came up with this idea that somehow this supernatural force would reveal to him the future of what his actions were going to cause. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this is the only way I can make him even more evil than he is that he just ignores it all.
So self-serving, and that's it. That's just Hunter Rose is in it for the reputation and the power and just domination of his fellow man. And I love that, he wasn't your typical mob boss. He did the dirty work. He was smart. He outthought everyone, like it was cool to see that application as opposed to Grendel versus Shadow, where he's kind of learning about that form of crime. It's less do it yourself.
Yeah, I was very inspired in the creation of Grendel by a couple of factors. One being, when I was a teenager, I was a big fan of Elric, the Michael Moorcock character, who, of course, took every convention of fantasy literature and just turned it on its head. So your main character was morally ambiguous, was not big and strong and heroic, got all his power from sorcery and this mystical sword that ate souls and fed it to him. And so it was a combination of that. That was kind of the first anti-hero stuff I'd ever read. And also a book that I read when I was about 12 years old called, surprisingly, Grendel, by a fellow named John Gardner, that told the story of the Beowulf legends, but from Grendel's point of view, sympathetic to Grendel. So Grendel's just this poor, misshapen thing that wants to be left alone, and Beowulf's this big, marauding Viking asshole that comes and kills him, And so those factors, and then also a couple of Italian comic book characters from the late 60s, early 70s that were kind of costumed gentleman criminals. One was called Criminal, spelled with a K, and the other was called Diabolique. In fact, there's a really cool movie from the 70s called Danger Diabolique. It's really, really psychotronic about this supervillain. It's directed by Mario Bava, who directed Sunday Bloody Sunday, Black Sunday, and a lot of these, a lot of the Barbara Steele horror movies, Italian horror movies from the 60s. I would advise everybody that has an interest in Grendel, go dig it up, because it's a real cool psychotronic version of that kind of character. With
cool.
I will have to check that out.
60s cars and styles and go-go boots, and it's just awesome.
I have to say, I'm actually really glad that you brought up the Beowulf Grendel, and it's like kind of drawing influence from that. That was one thing I wanted to touch on, because every time I've tried to introduce someone to the series, I'm like, yeah, it's Grendel, and they're like, oh, like Beowulf, and I'm like, yeah, but no. So I'm, I kind of have a little bit of an answer to some people now.
That's the right answer.
Yes, but no.
Yeah.
Like Beowulf, futuristic.
If you want Beowulf to be like more badass and like stick up for himself against the jerk that came to kill him in the future, I mean, Hunter Rose's story was just so sad to me, though, and like that's the one thing. Like Grendel was really dark.
They're all pretty sad, man.
Huh?
Yeah. They're all pretty.
In different ways. You touched on different types of stories. Like I make the comparison between like Rose and then that Grendel tale where it was the biker gang. They were sad for different reasons.
Yeah.
But there's this just overlining, highlighted sense of dread throughout every different Grendel story, regardless of who does what or who's and where. It's just going to end that way, and I love that.
And to piggyback on that a little bit, did you? When you were writing these characters and fleshing them out, was there any moment where because I've noticed a trend that Grendel kind of ends up meeting with these characters who are downtrodden, or, something happens that kind of brings them down and almost vulnerable. Are you playing on that intentionally, or is it just kind of something that happened naturally as you fleshed the characters out?
Yeah, I think the latter.
Okay.
That's not a huge predisposition, but again, the key to Grendel is don't try and moralize in it. Hunter's a very attractive character, but he's a very awful character. He's a bad guy. Christine,
people you want to relate to.
Christine, you can totally sympathize with what drives her to seek the vengeance she seeks. But it absolutely destroys her in every way, mentally, physically. In fact, I would say Brian Lee Sung is one of the few characters that kind of defeats the Grendel. He resists it, at one point, but even that leads to his destruction.
Yeah, he definitely fights it a lot harder than any of the other characters.
Mm-hmm. And, Grendel Prime, of course, is kind of an undying cyborg, but he's basically sacrificed his entire humanity to follow this ideal,
Yeah. Fair.
I think one of my favorite aspects about Grendel Prime as a character is you could literally explain away any team up or crossover with him. Like, that's why I love how you did the Grendel Prime Batman crossover along with the Hunter Rose one, but it makes more sense for me to see Prime jumping around the universe like you're about to do in space, because he is so, like I said, eternal.
Yeah.
You can turn him back on, you can flip him back on, you can put him back together and upgrade him and
shoot him out of a cannon into hit a fire and is walking out like the Terminator.
Well, and like I keep getting this sense that he's going to keep evolving.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned Terminator there, because of course Terminator 2 has certain thematic similarities to War Child.
Yep.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And the sad part is I started that long before Terminator 2 came out, but because of the collapse of Comico, my first publishing company, it was all tied up for a while. So when Terminator 2 came out, I was like, shit, they beat me to it.
You made my story.
And didn't tell me.
But, I took comfort in the fact that my main inspiration was actually more Lone Wolf and Cub. So,
That's awesome.
That's where I'm taking my inspiration.
So are you going out to New York then when Odyssey drops, or?
Yeah. I'll be there, and my son actually lives in New York right now, so
cool.
Nice.
We'll both be there, and we'll be signing at the Dark Horse booth first issue copies.
That's awesome.
Nice.
That was my first con, was New York, so I might have to pick up some tickets for this year and come see you. That would be great.
Sure thing, man. We'll be there, and we'll have. Probably be set up in Artist Alley as well, so it'll be available more than just during signing times.
Or as I like to call it, the Hall of the Gods. I remember the first time walking through there and just you never expect who you're going to see, but it's New York, so everyone.
That's we talked there about the difference between comics and film. There's also the question about what makes comics so special. And it used to be. Well, anything can happen in a comic. You could draw anything. You could draw big, giant cosmic shit. You could draw people lifting up enormous weights, leaping great distances. And now, of course, with CGI, that's all readily doable in the films.
Right.
And I tried to figure out what it is that makes comics so indelible on most people. And,
I think the difference is clear. Like, for me, I can go to a movie and get spoon-fed content and not have to imagine shit. But when I open up any comic book, I read it, but the back of my brain is putting together the panels that don't exist between what's happening. And I have to use that part of my brain to get it, but it's just a different way to consume the content. To me, it's just less spoon-fed. When I'm reading something, I'm putting everything together in my head that's not there.
You're participating in it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I guess that's my point, is that there's a real intimacy with comics. That people, once people get the bite, they get it hard, and they really, really, really love reading comics. And that follows through in what you were saying there about the Artist Alley situation. There's not many fields of entertainment or the arts where you could just go and, like, as you said, there's a hall full of everybody whose work you like.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen in rock and roll. That doesn't happen in the movies very much. That's, and you can just walk up to pretty much anybody whose work you like and say hi and shake their hand and get something signed,
Right.
So that intimacy maintains through the actual interaction and business of comics,
Yeah.
It's clear cut, because look at I love going to cons for the movie guests and stuff, but I can go meet Matt Wagner and shake his hand and not pay $50.
Yeah.
And get to be like, hey man, you left a huge stamp on my life. Thank you. You know what I mean? And I feel like it means more to a creator than someone that was just handed a role. You know what I mean? Regardless of their intentions or their love for the role or not. It still just means more to me to meet a creator.
Now, I don't want to be completely selfless. I do sell things at conventions.
Yeah, I know that. It's like
You're like, I'm still here to make some money.
It's
but I've always maintained. I'm surprised the number of people that ask me, "Do you charge for signatures?" And I've never charged for signatures, and I also do very quickie freebie head doodles for anybody that asks.
Oh,
Nice.
awesome.
You got your comic? Whip out the backing board. There's like a 10-second Batman head sketch.
That is
Hell
awesome.
yeah.
Cool.
And that's just not much to do. I don't feel it's much to do, and people are very appreciative of it. So that's my general policy.
That's a fan service.
Right. And, in an industry that is very money oriented for art, it's just nice to meet people that are like, let me share something with you because you care. It's because you have that passion.
Yeah. Now, again, that said, I have sketches for sale that are usually quite.
He's like, yes, I'll do you a doodle, but please look through my components.
Buy something.
Also, buy something.
I always have a little folio of pre-done sketches, and then I have a variety of prints, and then I do these freebies. So I'm trying to provide something for everybody at every sort of buying level and price range and et cetera.
That's awesome.
Keeping it accessible.
So are you going to be there all 3 days for New York? 3 or 4, right?
It's 4 days, I think, isn't it?
Okay. I've only done 2, so I don't know past 2.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yep. Probably so.
I'm from small town Nebraska. I couldn't handle more than 2. I'm like, where's the bathroom? Why are there so many people? Like, that was my first con, so it very much was a culture shock.
Yeah.
And then from that to like local cons and other stuff, and I was like, okay, I can breathe.
Easing in.
Yeah, right. That'll be fun though, man. Like, I really got to try and get to that this year. You know what I mean? I didn't go last year. I went the year before and all that stuff. So it's been a minute.
I will say those are pretty well-run cons. It's a group called Reed Pop, and they run that one and the Chicago one, C2E2.
Yeah.
The Emerald City one in the Seattle. And again, it's a pretty big operation, and I think they run them pretty well.
And there's just so much for your dollar. One of the biggest complaints I have, I guess not complaints, just things I'd like to see, is some cons just don't provide enough to do for the money. I need to be able to sit there all day and be entertained and go to different stuff, sensory stuff and setups and displays and games. There's some cons I go to and I'm like, $50 for the day, and then I'm just like, I saw everything in 2 hours.
Yeah. I think that's definitely more localized to our region and these smaller conventions.
We'll get there, though. Nebraska's building it, It's just one step at a time. So.
You know what? I was to a convention in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and it was pretty big space and bigger space than they had. Even though they had quite a bit of display and such, it was still a bigger space than they needed per se. And so at one end, they had a haunted house set up, like a houses. I thought that was brilliant.
Crazy.
It was really great.
One of our local cons, Comic-Con, they do like live wrestling shows. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, there's
I didn't know.
the Motor City Con in Detroit used to do that. Yeah,
That's awesome.
All
We're about to have I think a Midwest tattoo convention in Council Bluffs, and they do like midget wrestling and like all these crazy like fire spitters. I'm just like, what?
I've gone to see one of those, and they're actually like, you're walking into it and you're like, this is going to be terrible. It's actually awesome.
Dude, I
They've
go
got
to
like,
wrestling all the time.
yeah, well, instead of like the metal chairs, they have like little turkey pans and like mini baseball
Like
bats.
tiny things.
Yeah, it's a good time. It's hilarious.
I don't know if any of you ever been to the San Diego Con, but it has become such a giant just culture fest.
Yeah.
There's a whole industry going on outside of the convention center. Where it sits in San Diego is near a hospitality district called the Gaslamp District.
Yeah.
Okay.
Restaurants and clubs and stuff like that. And they now in the last several years during the con, they cordon that off. No cars allowed through, only foot traffic, and it is like Mardi Gras. I mean, there are people everywhere. There's fire breathers, there's break dancers, there's all sorts of street performers. It's really crazy.
Yeah, I think that's
awesome.
something that bigger cons have started to do more. Even mid-level cons like here, like there's some in Kansas City that'll do that, and they'll have deals with like local bars and stuff where it's like, come in your cosplay costume and have an after party. And I think it's cool to see the community. It's money oriented, obviously, but it's just cool to see the community spread across the city like that and kind of take over a town.
And some of the local businesses embracing this idea rather than who are you and why do you dress like that?
Right.
Oh yeah, no, San Diego, those restaurants down in that Gaslamp District, they all have for the week of the con, they all have special cocktails named after superheroes. They all have special dinner plates named after characters, etc.
It's essentially Nerd City for a weekend. And
Yeah.
I think when I went to New York, there was like random things going on, but they weren't, like the huge bar downtown's doing it. It was like I met Ryan Brown, who does God Hates Astronauts.
Okay.
And he was doing a release, like a weird party. He called it a wizard party, where you dress up like a wizard and you just show up at this random underground bar with Ryan Brown and hang out in wizard costumes. I was like, everywhere there was just random little events like that weren't really necessarily tied to the con.
We should do that here for no reason.
Right.
That sounds awesome.
I should have my birthday.
Yeah, right? May needs a wizard party. But I just enjoy when the community can get around it.
You have to wear a big beard.
Yeah.
It's like it's a requirement.
I'll just not
The
shave.
password is like you have to have a beard.
Oh, God. Oh, God. Well, Matt, we really do appreciate you taking the time, man. Like I said, we are probably the two biggest Grendels in Omaha, so it just means a lot to talk to the con, and get some answers on what it was like to make this,
Yeah. This has been pretty dope for me.
Still making it, I will point out.
Yeah, right?
Yes,
Still
absolutely.
making it.
Which I actually just found out about this when we started talking about doing the interview, and I, short of, maybe the Sharks winning Game 7, I don't think I've gotten that excited about anything in a long time.
Right on, man. Thanks.
I will remind my listeners that this is a not safe for work podcast. I'll use that as a preface. I'll say this is what Jake actually said. He goes, "Please don't text me things like that. I don't need to get hard at work." And I go, ready to get even harder? It's coming out this year. We haven't heard this for so long about Grendel. We've seen the team ups and the crossovers, which is great, but you just want to see it continue as a fan.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was happy to hear it was continuing at all. I was stupendously overjoyed that it's taking place in space, because now it's like unlimited possibility, So, but
it was on hiatus for a while because I had this other little gig called Mage that was taking a moment.
Yep.
Well, we are thankful for Grendel, because Grendel definitely left an impression on us, man. I gotta say.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. It's been really good talking to you.
Hey, you as well.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt.
As always, I've been Mikey Colsheen. You've been listening to the Weekly Geekly. With me has been
Jake Barnett.
May.
And the man himself, Matt Wagner. Check out all his stuff. Now under Dark Horse, so go check it out. Get your local comic book store copies at Krypton. And we'll see you next time, guys. Thank you for listening.
You're listening to the Weekly Geekly, Omaha's counterculture podcast.